There we go. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. As you know, I'm going to talk about Christian nationalism. And the best way to talk about Christian nationalism is to start out by talking about what it's not. And it's not Christianity. It's quite separate from the Christian religion. And I believe that most Christians you will meet are decidedly not Christian nationalists. So what is it? It's a political ideology. It seeks to merge Christian beliefs and symbols with national identity and public policy. They believe that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that Christianity should be infused in all aspects of American society. Though the majority of Americans, about 67%, reject or are skeptical of Christian nationalism, it resonates strongly with two religious groups, 66% of white evangelicals and 55% of Hispanic Protestants, who say they support or sympathize with this movement. And according to a 2023 American Values Atlas survey conducted nationwide by the Public Religion Research Institute, they interviewed over 22,000 adults in 50 states. They measured the respondents' affinity for the following statements. First, the US government should declare America a Christian nation. Then US laws should be based on Christian values. And if the US moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. So being Christian is an important part of being truly American, and God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Hispanic Protestants were the only religious group that saw an increase in support for Christian nationalism. It grew by 12% between the first survey that they did in 2022 and this 2023 survey. So they are also believers of the Seven Mountains, which you probably have never heard of, and unless you've heard me before. It is a dominionist conservative Christian movement which believes that there are 7 aspects of society that they should influence, which is family, religion, education, media, arts, business, and government, which pretty well covers everything. So the question of are we a Christian nation certainly has to be addressed. And there's a huge difference between being a Christian nation and being majority Christian, which we are. You only have to go to our founding documents. They are secular. There was no intent on being a Christian nation. We are one of the most religious countries in the world, especially across religions. And it's this principle of church-state separation that protects America's religious freedom. So keep in mind that the individual rights and diversity we enjoy can't be maintained if the government promotes Christianity or if our government takes on the trappings of a faith-based state. And because our government is neutral on religious matters, leaving such decisions to individuals, that is what has allowed a broad array of religious groups to grow and flourish. America celebrates the idea that you can live your life as you see fit, as long as you're not harming others, and that no one should be forced to live under another's religious dictates. Both of those principles are actually under attack by the Christian nationalists, and it's the most vulnerable members of our society who are taking the hit. I don't want anyone to think that Christian nationalism is something that's just new and came about because of Donald Trump or anything like that. It has been here since at least the 1920s, even if it only became obvious about a decade ago. And it started with this Gerald Lyman Kenneth Smith, who you probably also have never heard of. He was a political organizer for Huey Long in the 1930s. He was a fascist, anti-Semite, and anti-communist. And in the early 1940s, he started the Christian Nationalist Crusade, also the Christian Nationalist Party, the America First Party, and an extremist monthly publication called The Cross and the Flag. He was someone who believed that communism was a Jewish plot and that communists used Black people as their pawns to try and overthrow white Christian America. He peddled the myth of America's Christian founding through his publication. He had this enormous mailing list of like over 3 million people. And he used this idea to paint non-Christians as outsiders, although his definition of Christian was somewhat more narrow than it might be today, because for a while, Catholics and Mormons were not included under the Christian umbrella of Christianity. It was the idea that America belongs to Christian people, to white Christian people, and that others they were tolerated as kind of guests, visitors, as second-class Americans, but not quite real Americans. It builds upon a history that is surrounded by patriotism around the founding fathers and how Christian they were. So there's some stuff that's new about Christian nationalism too. And most noticeable is the increased influence among the right wing. And when did it happen? What was that turning point? Many look at the 1962 Supreme Court rulings banning school-sponsored prayer in public schools. Opposition to this ruling is seen as a turning point, which was widely embraced by the right. And these rulings, there was Engel versus Vitale and Abington School District versus Schempp, really angered the right-wing Christians and gave the nationalists new material to recruit from this newly outraged crowd. And this ammunition really helped shape the movement. Before this ruling, there was a real reticence of Christians to be open in their politics. There was a feeling that it was somehow not quite nice and inappropriate to campaign and talk to people about their faith or their church. But after these rulings, that reticence started to melt away. And a segment of the opposition was very clearly anti-Semitic. New scapegoats were the Anti-Defamation League and the American Civil Liberties Union. And these rulings fed into Smith's anti-Semitic rhetoric and bolstered Christian nationalism's appeal to extremists looking for a scapegoat. In the platform of Christian nationalism, hate is absolutely critical to the upkeep of a white Christian society. And you can't have a white Christian society as superior unless you hate everyone else. Oh, sorry. Okay, that's where I was. So that trend continued into the 1970s, and religion became much more legitimate in politics. You can think about the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition, and it was really capitalized upon by the rise of people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. Another person that was a pivotal figure in the movement was Walter Huss, and he was pivotal in the history of Oregon's far right movement. And I don't know how much you know about Oregon, but there's parts of Oregon that are very progressive and very liberal, and the other parts are very conservative and far right. And in fact, parts of Oregon are trying to leave Oregon and not physically leave it, but have parts of Oregon become parts of Idaho. Anyway, Walter Huss was another anti-Semite and conspiracy theory, and he argued that Judaism was an existential threat to America and to Christianity. And when he talked about this, some people would call him a bigot, but he would always respond by saying, I'm not being a bigot, I'm speaking the truth. Jews get mad about it because they can't handle the truth. They want to shut me up because I'm speaking the truth. So that was his kind of view of the world. During the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan actively courted these forces, from where he announced his campaign, and it had been one of continued GOP acceptance of Christian nationalist ideals and talking points. And those things have really helped Christian nationalism go mainstream. And since 1970, one of the troubling innovations that's happened is using the language of religious freedom and defining that as the freedom to discriminate in the name of religion. So, in looking at the people who are really affected by this and impacted by this, we can look at the LGBTQ plus community, and Christian nationalists say they can do whatever they like to that community because God tells us the truth about what proper sexuality is. God has told us what these truths are, so we're just acting out this truth. And they say that's called expressing our religious freedom. And they look to the Supreme Court to protect the right of religious people to be bigots in the name of freedom. And as the Supreme Court has gone more and more to the right, this is becoming more and more of a problem. And it's not just a political belief, but it puts anyone who opposes it into disagreement with God and the Constitution's promise of religious freedom. The viewpoint of Christian nationalists is divinely inspired, and there's no room for disagreement. To Christian nationalists, discrimination against the LGBTQ community or against Jews or liberals is not only not bad, it's not even discrimination. To them, it's a direct application and enforcement of God's commands. So it was founded on anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and the upkeep of a white Christian state. It's rooted in hate, and it relies on discrimination by design. And that's why it's important to understand its history. It helps you understand the threat that it poses today. And while Christian nationalists and their allies cloak themselves in the language of religious freedom, a look at the movement's history paints a different picture, which is one of intolerance, fear, abuse, and deception. And as much as Christian nationalists may try to hide their origins, the movement will forever be colored by the hate they practice and the harm that they continue to inflict. They believe that their God is the only thing that should influence laws and determine our rights. And any law not based on the authority of their Christian God is essentially meaningless. So for Christian nationalists, our government, the TV shows we watch, the music we listen to, how we structure our family life, how we engage with one another should be informed by their God. The true danger of the ideology lies not only in that they believe this, but they're now actively trying to enact it into our policy. So what have they been up to in the past few months? So we can start out with fetal personhood. Everyone is familiar with the Alabama Supreme Court, who decided that frozen embryos are children. And as frightening as the decision was, the opinion from Chief Justice Tom Parker was even more frightening. He is involved with the new Apostolic Reformation, which follows the Seven Mountain Mandate, which I talked about earlier. And in his opinion, he emphasized the sanctity of human life and invoked a divine perspective. So this is what he said. I'm quoting from his opinion. Human life cannot be wrongfully destroyed without incurring the wrath of a holy God, who views the destruction of his image as an affront to himself. Even before birth, all human beings bear the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without effacing his glory. So, unsurprisingly, the ruling sparked a big debate. It not only challenged the separation of church and state, but it also prompted certain providers to suspend IVF services. And while recent legislation aimed to provide immunity to both providers and patients, it has failed to stop all the concerns. And one IVF center has opted not to resume care, citing insufficient protection within the new legal framework. And it's important to remember that fetal personhood is a goal of the Christian nationalist movement. It's a way to control women. It's a way to police their bodies. It's a way to regulate them to second-class citizenship, and because that's what the Christian nationalist ideology dictates. So in other words, we're talking about dragging the country back to a time when conservative white Christian men ruled, and that's the goal of Christian nationalism in America. And that is what we're fighting against. It's important to remember that Chief Justice Tom Parker's opinion is grounded entirely in theology. And when he asserts that any other outcome would have provoked the wrath of a holy God, and this is not recent with him. In a dissenting opinion going back to 2005 in a child custody case in which the majority affirmed an award of custody to the child's grandparents, Parker cited not legal cases or statutes, but rather from the Bible, Romans chapter 13, for the proposition that there is no authority except from God. And because of that, the state should stay out of family law matters. What makes Parker a particularly interesting case for the Christian right is his continued immersion in the theology of the New Apostolic Reformation. They're followers of the Seven Mountain Mandate, which I mentioned earlier, and leaders are becoming increasingly politicized and radicalized around the idea that Christians should control key positions of power and influence in all arenas of society. And they were central to organizing Christians to show up and do spiritual warfare at the January 6th Capitol riot. So another area that they have been seeking to infiltrate are primary school classrooms. And what they've tried to do is to coerce students into religious participation and penalize dissenters. And despite all the legal battles fought, they persist. For example, the recent bill in West Virginia mandating the display of In God We Trust in all classrooms sailed through both the Senate and the House. And this is just one example of the ongoing struggle to maintain secular education standards in the face of religious pressure. And of course, we can look here in Orange Unified School District, two conservative members who were recalled in the recent election in what centered largely on debates over public school policies on gender and sexuality, LGBTQ rights. And at the same time, there's the Placentia Yorba Linda School District. In 2020, the school board was overtaken by a MAGA conspiracy-driven majority, which has blocked book approvals and the passage of their silly resolution to ban CRT in 2022. And 4 of the 5 current board members have ideologies of putting religion in the curriculum, limiting access to books and other educational material, and boldly targeting the teachers' union on their social media platforms. And last year, the school district adopted a parental notification policy that would notify parents of a student they call a clear and present danger to themselves or others, and saying that this is a tool to make sure that our parents are informed about things all the way from disruption of student learning through extreme situations. While the policy does not contain the words gender identity or transgender, concerns have already surfaced that the policy will be used to target LGBTQ students. Another area that the Christian nationalists are trying to incorporate into school and education started in Kentucky. The legislator is considering a bill that would compel schools to incorporate a video on fetal development, which is life begins at conception. And that bill has 3 goals. to undermine accurate health education, to take away reproductive rights, and to use education to shape public opinion. And similar bills are under consideration in 3 other states. Christian nationalists are also looking to make changes to fostering programs and adoption programs. And they're encouraging child services to consider religious beliefs in the foster process. So in Tennessee, they encourage child services to consider prospective foster or adoptive parents based on their religious beliefs and anything that opposes the LGBT community. And one has to consider what that does to LGBTQ kids who are in the foster system, because so many of them are, and many of these kids find themselves in state custody because their families are intolerant of their gender identity or sexual orientation. And allowing placement of these kids with families who are not supportive of their identities only risks compounding the trauma. On the topic of LGBTQ rights, a new public opinion poll has found that support is declining for LGBTQ rights instead of increasing. And a relentless drumbeat of Christian nationalist propaganda may be responsible for this. And erosion is found surprisingly in young people. The survey found that most Americans support LGBTQ protections, but that the figure is dropping. It was 80% in 2022, and it came down to 76% last year. And in 2020, 83% of Americans aged 18 to 29 supported non-discrimination laws. And today that figure has dropped to 75%. So it's very scary that our young people are opposing LGBT rights. And 60% of Americans oppose allowing small businesses to refuse to serve LGBT customers on the basis of the business owner's religious beliefs. But that figure has dropped as well. And support for marriage equality now stands at 67%, which is a loss of 2 points. And among young adults, it has dipped from 74% to 71%. And unsurprisingly, the report finds that the more a person identifies with Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to reject LGBTQ rights. In this group, 52% oppose non-discrimination laws, and only 22% of them support marriage equality. So what are these people doing? They're promoting a narrow exclusionary worldview that seeks to impose a singular religious perspective on public life, marginalizing those who do not conform to its dictates. They're gaining momentum, with 3 in 10 Americans believing that America is a Christian nation, and there are a growing number of Christian nationalists in very powerful positions. I mean, you just have to look at the Supreme Court. Justices such as Amy Coney Barrett openly cite religious beliefs as guiding principles in her legal decision. The Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, Mike Johnson, says he derives his worldview from religious doctrine. And this is just bad. And Andrew Seidel, who is an expert on the Christian right, puts it this way. He says the goal is to impose a conservative Christian religion on the entire country through the rule of law, to make it so that the law protects conservative white Christian men, but does not bind them, and that the law binds everybody else, but does not protect them. And their goal is to do it through the courts and not through the ballot box. It's obviously imperative that we stand firm and united. Christian nationalists have a very ambitious plan for 2025, and it's documented in this thing called Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation. And they have many different allies entrenched in key positions of influence, and these pose significant threats to our liberties. The decisions made this year in this election will reverberate for years, if not decades to come. And we obviously could spend a lot of time discussing Trump's presidential transition plan from the Heritage Foundation, but simply it proposes slashing the U.S. Department of Justice funding, dismantling the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, gutting environmental and climate change regulations to favor fossil fuel production, and eliminating the cabinet's departments of education and commerce. And the Washington Post reported last year that Project 2025 includes immediately invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807 to deploy the military for domestic law enforcement and directing the DOJ to pursue Trump adversaries. So we must continue to advocate for our secular democracy and rights. And one part of Christian nationalism is the idea that being Christian is core to the American identity. And that's nothing new, either in American religious culture or its politics. But it used to be a radical proposal. Recently, however, it's been embraced as a badge of honor. Marjorie Taylor Greene sells proud Christian nationalist t-shirts on her websites. Books defending Christian nationalism are given serious discussion, and these developments rightfully raise concerns. But there is a solution, and you guys more than anyone know this, and that is to vote. And more than that, donate where you can and give the time and effort that you can. And that is Christian nationalism in a nutshell. I'm happy to take any questions.